Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I wish to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to speak today about the present state and the future of psychiatry. I will start with the good news because I think that in fighting for mental health, we have won several very important battles. The United Nations, for example, have recognized that mental health is important. And not only have they recognized this, but they have also put the promotion of mental health among their sustainable development goals, which represent the commitment of the governments of the world to do something about the improvement of mental health. I think it's fair to say that the treatment technology, the technology which we have to treat mentally ill people, is also advanced, that we can say that most mental disorders now can be treated with a fair chance of success. Some of them still we do not know what to do about, like, for example, in the instance of dementia. But even with dementia, we have a number of useful measures which can be recommended for you. So the technology of treatment and care has significantly advanced. Most countries in the world have become aware that stigma is very important. And stigma, of course, is the chief enemy of any mental health programs. It is the bad image that is linked to mental health and mental illness. And the bad image linked to mental illness is expanding itself to not only to the patient and his existence, but also to the family, to the institutions in which people are being treated, to medications which are being used. So many people have become aware that this is a major enemy, and a number of countries have started major programs. For example, in the United Kingdom, there was a big program in Denmark, in New Zealand, in Australia, in Canada. A number of countries have extremely good programs which are now underway. We've also been successful in increasing the number of mental health professionals, so that today, for example, there are some 250,000 psychiatrists in the world, an enormous increase in comparison with only some 20 years ago. In many places, we have now seen that people who are relatives and people who have experienced mental illness have created organizations which are both advocating the cause of people with mental illness and also introducing their voice into the debate about legislation and about ways in which budgets are being produced and so forth. We have formal recognition in many places that human rights of the mentally ill people are human rights like anybody else's, and that therefore we have to be careful in our management of hospitals, in our management of the services, to ensure that these human rights are respected. If we look further, we also see that the research on mental health has got significantly more support in many places, the European Union, China, the United States. In many other places, the amount of money that has gone into research has also increased. And finally, also in a number of countries, there is a continuing increase of the effort to promote mental health, not only to reduce the number of mentally ill people and mental illness in the community, but instead to think of ways in which people, anybody in the society, can think about mental health as being important, where we have promoted the value, we've given more value to the mental health among the many values that people have. But it's not all that good that I have said. There is still only a small proportion of the large number of people with mental illness who receive appropriate treatment. We reckon that today approximately 80% of people with severe mental illness like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, are in the countries of the low and middle income are not receiving care, any care. And that even in the highly developed countries, in Europe, for example, there is still 1/5, about 20% of the people who are simply not receiving any treatment or receive inappropriate treatment. In many places, the human rights are not yet completely protected, and there are still a number of places where we would have to do quite a bit of work to make sure that they are protected. In the countries which I mentioned, which have stigma programs, which are very good, these programs are still separate programs. In fact, it is of essential importance that we see stigma programs as becoming part of the normal health program, that a proportion of the program is given to fighting stigma. In the same way as people who produce cars spend a proportion of their entire budget on promoting the use of their cars, in the same way, the health services should spend a significant proportion of their entire budget on thinking about reducing stigma, on thinking about making people aware of its nefarious influence and doing something about it. And then, if you look at the educational programs that exist, we still see that most of the programs for people who are devoting their life to dealing with mental disorders and helping people who have them, still the main part of the treatment is focused on the treatment of my major mental disorders, with much less emphasis on several other things. For example, the prevention of mental illness, which is possible to a large degree, and to a variety of other important components of mental health care. Mental health legislation is outdated in many countries. In some African countries, there are legislation which is still very similar and inspired of the legislation, for example, from in France of the 1898. And in other countries as well, the legislation has not been following the development of care, the development of ideas, development of treatment opportunities. It's not yet where it should be. And laws in many countries would need amendments or recasting. While I said that there is a lot of money that has gone into mental health research, I also have to say that the size of the problem and the amount of our ignorance is still enormous, and therefore much more should be invested into the research on mental disorders. The associations of people who have experienced mental illness or their families, yes, they function, but very often they depend on one or two or three people who are moving it. And when they themselves, for one reason or another, either because of illness or because of other reasons, stop doing, the associations sink in their activities and very often become inactive. And alcohol problems and drug abuse problems are still on the rise enormously. During the COVID epidemic, one of the chief problems that has been noticed has been an increase of alcohol clandestinely and without telling anybody, but people have been using alcohol much more. And part of the violence that COVID has been reporting, the violence within families that has been reported, has been due to the abuse of alcohol. But the same is true also for drugs, so that in countries where alcohol problems are somewhat less, we are also seeing that drug control is not yet successful into full. And then the promotion of mental health, which should really start in elementary school, making people aware how precious it is to have a mentally healthy child, has not yet been sufficiently supported, sufficiently underlined, sufficiently done. So yes, in summary, there have been very great successes, but we are still having many things that we have to do, which have not yet been successful. And while this is happening, there is a number of trends in society which significantly affect the development of mental health program. The first of these is what has been called the commoditification of medicine. Commoditification comes from the word commodity. It was a term that was introduced by the World Bank. The commodity are like sugar or like cotton or iron, and health is treated in the same way as if it was a commodity. More you pay, more you get. If a health program is not financially successful, it is not a good program. And this thinking of having to commodify everything, to express everything in terms of material financial gain, is a major enemy to what we are doing. And I think that it's something that we have to understand, that there are many aspects, such as quality of life, which do not exclusively depend on the amount of money. And the fact that a hospital is producing a profit doesn't mean that it is providing good service. And we should not judge a hospital by thinking about the amount of profit that will be made, but rather think about ways in which the mental health of people who have been treated can be improved, and experience which people have during their stay in hospital. Another major trend that has been present is the digitalization of medicine. This digitalization of medicine has entered everywhere. We are now seeing that this facilitates access to information. It makes it very much easier to obtain data. It also, the electronics and in various other technological progress has made dependence on machine much greater. But while all these are positive events, there is also a negative trace, which is that people complain that mental and other services are becoming dehumanized. We are seeing in Europe a greater reliance and seeking traditional healers, people who deal what is called alternative medicine, who don't use the modern medical apparatus at all, but instead they listen to their to patients who come to them. They listen to them and try to understand. They're much more human in their approach, humane in their approach than people who are in the system that has become so mightily enforced by technology, but lost some of its human elements. And then there is an element, a process which is going on, which is very important, and that is a continuing fragmentation of many professions, including medicine. Medicine is falling into ever smaller specialties, so that there is a specialty which is no longer the orthopedics, but it is now a person who is specialized in the shoulder articulations only, or another one who is exclusively dealing with a particular disease. Even in psychiatry, we now have specialists in depressive disorders or in early interventions or specialists in a particular type of disease. And this splitting of medicine and of psychiatry into ever smaller disciplines is of course understandable because the total amount of knowledge has grown so much. And it's also financially attractive because the top specialists receive much more money than people who are in general practice. So that this phenomenon of gradual fragmentation of medicine is a big enemy to what we're trying to do, instead of trying to bring things together. And the fragmentation of medicine as such has also led to various efforts. People speak of ways in which that could be done. And in some countries, it has now become a major problem that we do not know as yet how to stop growing. Other changes in society that are important, that we should remember them as we are talking about the present state of psychiatry, is, for example, the urbanization, which has led to a huge increase of cities. A country like, for example, Jakarta, which is now the second largest city in the world, or New Delhi, or some other cities with tens of millions of people living in the same place, very often with inappropriate environmental sanitation, very often with a variety of phenomena that go on in the cities in which people lose their identity, in which communities do not exist anymore, because the communities as such have fallen apart by the rapid immigration of people. Take the example of Argentina, in which now about 96% of the population lives in towns, and about half of these people who have moved to towns have moved within the last 20 or 30 years, which in fact makes the city an agglomeration, an accumulation of groups and groupuscules, small groups, which are no longer having the character of the community which we have previously been used to see, and which have been the basis for the 19th century and the 20th century strategy of community care and community medicine. It's very difficult to provide community care if there is no community. And that is something that is happening in many places. The demographic characteristics of countries have also changed in a very important way. In particular, the prolonged work into higher age that has previously not been so very frequent, the prolonged adolescence, a period during which there are no social roles or social responsibilities that these young people have to face. In my youth, boys of 14 were supposed to start working. Now it is at the age of 20, 22, 25, 30 before one really gets a position in which one has to show social responsibility. And then there is, of course, a significant change of the role of women, who in many countries have started to work much more outside of the house. But the problem with that is that while they are working outside and producing an extremely useful contribution to society, nobody is taking away the various roles which they have played before, like looking after the elderly, looking after children, looking after their family, looking after social networking, all of these, all on their shoulders still. And so that the total amount of effort which they have to carry is much larger. And that is a risk factor for both dissatisfaction and for mental illness. And then there is a more recent phenomenon, which I think for us in psychiatry is particularly important. And that is what has been called the horizontalization of information exchange. People talk to people who are of the same age and a similar profession, and they are not aware of what goes on vertically. So that the transmission of knowledge and experience from people with higher age to their youngers is significantly diminished or disappears. And the horizontalization is not only true for information exchange, but also in a disruption of the relationship between the different layers of the community. So that in some countries, such as, for example, Bangladesh or China, there has been recent legislation punishing children who are not looking after their parents. And that is in countries which have been proud of the fact that they respected their elders and respected and looked after their elderly. And the same is true for the younger generation, which is very often growing up with practically no influence from the layer above them or two layers above them, from their parents or grandparents. Horizontalization is a phenomenon which is supported by the social media to a large extent. And it's important to be aware of it, because any measure that we are introducing has to be considered in terms of its use and instead of its spread. And that one will no longer be, as it was before, mixed and vertical and horizontal, but probably strictly horizontal. There are good things as well. The self-help, for example, that has been promoted in Australia has been a very useful development in which people learn how to deal with some problems while they are young in school. It's much more useful to learn how to solve problems while you are in school than to know and be able to cite the order of kings over the last 5,000 years. The relationship between doctors and patients has also changed, because the doctors are now faced with patients who know a great deal about their illness. They've been just looking up what their illness is and what the treatments are at their computer. And they come to the doctor very much more informed. And it presents a challenge to the doctor, who has to find ways of helping them to understand the information and also adding extra bits that he thinks is important. And despite of all of this, I'm a great optimist, and I think that science is continuously making progress and discovering things, and that these discoveries will be reflected both in medicine and other forms of human endeavor. So we should at no time be pessimistic about development. And then there are new battles which we have to fight. And that is an important. We have to think of ways in which we are going to make mental health highly valued by people, that they will think about mental health being more important than many other things. Because once we have raised their sense of value of mental health, they will themselves become the main carrier of mental health programs. We still have to continue fighting very much for the respect of human rights of people with mental illness, and more so now, also the human rights of the carers of people with mental illness. And not only of the negative rights, so that they shouldn't be abused, etc., but also the positive rights. We are now seeing that gradually people think that when the voting in a country which relies on voting is happening, that people start thinking, these people who had the mental illness and are now in hospital, nobody's taken away their voting rights. Why are they not asked whom they would like to see govern their lives. A number of other positive rights also have to be protected, and we have to be actively involved in thinking of ways in which rights can be protected. A major new battle before us is also the prevention of mental illness. We have, some time ago, while I was in the World Health Organization, produced a document which we submitted to the General Assembly, in which we listed all the various forms of primary prevention of mental and neurological disorders. And we have more or less calculated that approximately 40 to 50% of all mental and neurological morbidity could be arrested by appropriate primary prevention. I'm giving you here a few examples of primary prevention. The first one is the correction of mild sensory deficits. Even in a country such as Switzerland, which is having a regular school examination in schools, examinations of all children for their eyesight and so forth, hypermetropia is often missed. And we have a granddaughter, and she was one day, her mother was called to come and to consult with the teacher, because the teacher felt that it would be perhaps helpful that the child be seen by an ophthalmologist, because she felt that the child has some problems, but perhaps more important than that, that she should be treated for dyslexia. What in fact happened was that she was hypermetropic and she could not read very well. And a pair of glasses changed the situation completely. And she was first in class. But the fact is that approximately 20 to 30% of all hypermetropic children in highly developed countries are not discovered as having hypermetropia, and therefore do not like reading, have problems reading, read much slower, and learn much more difficult, with much more difficulty. Mild sensory deficits are also, for example, of hearing. Very often label the child who is not hearing well as being disobedient, stubborn, learning less well, and gradually being pushed into a role of being a child with retardation, a child of an impairment, with an impairment. And yet, simply by putting the child not in the last bench in the classroom, but into the first one, and speaking to it a little more loudly, would have made a huge difference. There is a variety of other primary prevention possibilities. For example, the perinatal care, immensely important and providing many opportunities for the prevention of mental disorders in the mother, who, as you well know, will very often be exposed to a higher risk of perinatal depression, both before and after the childbirth. Also, the problems that could be existing between the father and mother during the time of childbearing, perinatal care. Also, the ways in which the women who are at a time of perinatal time, particularly before childbirth, very keen to learn as much as possible about health of their own and health of their child. It's an opportunity to teach them enormously about ways of recognizing illness, dealing with problems, and finding ways of dealing with illness as well. There is a variety of other interventions which are important. There is an estimate that in many countries of a low income, up to 10 to 20%, depending on the country, of all children in the country are stunted, are less well developed, because they had a lack of food, but also not only lack of food, but also lacks of other elementary things which could be provided for them with a little bit of an effort, such as a little more stimulation and a variety of other possible correctives of the early stunting. Because stunting in itself, not an illness, makes people vulnerable to a variety of illnesses. I could go on listing a variety of problems that can be reached by primary prevention. The main point, however, about this is that psychiatrists, in order to deal with primary prevention, has to change his role. From being a person who treats the mental illness, he must become a person who can convince the Minister of Health to do something about mental illness, about the prevention of mental disorder. Iodine supplementation, for example, if we could provide women in childbearing age with iodine in a sufficient amount, we could prevent every year about 4 to 6 million children who are born as cretins. Now, the psychiatrist will not go around distributing iodine, but he has to convince the minister that one of the measures that is important will be an appropriate control of iodine and other supplementation that is necessary during pregnancy. Now, that's one huge area in which we are having to work. It's the area of trying to see to what an extent we can prevent mental illness altogether and neurological illness. There is also secondary prevention in which we can reduce the amount of disability that a disease will produce. And the tertiary and quarterly prevention in which we are going to ensure that people with disability are not handicapped, they are not experiencing significant social disadvantages because of their illness. And all of these types of prevention have been to a large extent neglected until now. So the third, as I mentioned, the other two, the third major area of work is primary prevention of mental and neurological disorders, as well as secondary and tertiary prevention. And then there is the big problem which is facing, and many people facing psychiatry, and many people say that it is the chief problem of medicine for the coming century. And that is the problem of comorbidity, particularly of comorbidity of mental and physical illness. The comorbidity of mental and physical illness is continuously growing. One part of it is what Professor Grunberg many years ago has called is the failure of our success. We have made people gain more life expectancy, more years of life, but we have not given them healthy lives. The gain in life expectancy has been gained in sick years. People are alive longer, but they have diseases which are going with them, chronic, non-communicable diseases of different types, but also other communicable diseases which are present. Now, that is one set of diseases. Combined with the mental disorders, they are significant problem and the challenge before medicine for this century. We know that people with mental illness will die 15 to 20 years earlier than those who do not have a mental illness, but they do not die from their mental illness. They die from the comorbid physical illnesses which are very often not appropriately treated, not least also because the mental disorder is not supporting an appropriate care of the self-care of people. So the comorbidity is a big problem. And it is a problem that has to be approached in new ways. In some countries, people are speaking a great deal about what is being called collaborative care. Wonderful when it works. But very often, collaborative care, where it has worked, it has been the result of a good relationship that has been established on grounds, I would almost say, non-professional grounds, between a group of general practitioners and the psychiatric department, or between some other combination of these. But the collaborative care and the care of comorbid conditions must become a major topic in the education of general practitioners, in the education of internists, in the education of gynecologists and various other professions that we are having. All of our professions must become aware of the frequency of comorbidity and of basic measures that they have to take, both to discover and to deal with comorbidity. And then there is another area which I think has been rediscovered recently, and that is a rediscovery of what has been called the non-specific aspects of treatment and of living together. This is something that has been described in the 1930s by Frankl and others, but I think that these non-specific aspects of treatment include respect for the patient, listening to people with care, trying to make sure that the person's dignity is preserved, thinking of ways in which one can involve the person who is not well in a contract, in a collaborative effort to regain health. There is a book that has been published in the United States that had a great effect. It's called The Rabbit Effect. And it's a funny little book, but it speaks, it describes it's the rabbit effect. The words have come from the fact that in a laboratory in which some scientists were examining the influence of diet on the rabbit health. They were giving them a very heavy diet, and the rabbits were dying of heart disease. Now, except a small number of rabbits who did not seem to die as quickly. And when they started thinking, why is this group of rabbits not dying as much as the others? They discovered that one of the lab assistants who was looking after these rabbits, one of them liked rabbits, spoke to them, played with them a little bit, let them walk around a little bit. And the sheer fact that more care was given, more, if you wish, empathy and emotional care was given to a group of rabbits, stopped them from dying from heart disease. Now, how much more is that present in the field of mental health and medicine in general, where a relationship with the patient is of tremendous importance, and if appropriately established, can make such a huge difference. And we have seen this also in the field of psychiatry. In Germany, there is what has been called the Weglaufhäuser. This is the homes to which you can run if you have a trouble. And these homes are not a psychiatry department. They are just an apartment in which there is usually one person who is the host is a person who has previously experienced mental illness, but who is willing to accept somebody who is under major stress for a day or two or three, possibly with the advice of a nurse, and having a chance to decompensate, somehow to decrease the tension which has been at its place. And it was not so much treatment as just giving a chance for the person to come back to. And we have to think of that as a strategy. We have to think of ways in which we can use the non-specific aspects of treatment in all forms of treating illness, not only in the field of psychiatry. But for many of these tasks, psychiatrists are not really appropriately educated. And the main form of education is that they are missing communication skills, which they should be given in a serious and major way during their education. Skills of listening, skills of convincing. When they come to the minister to speak about the provision of iodine, they should know how to convince people about the importance of the measure. Skills of negotiation, skills of leadership, in which they can bring people together, make the team work. All of these skills and many more are practically never taught. There are people who are talented who have them from God or from their family, but most of the people are not so fortunate and could and would learn. We have done a program in which we have involved some 3,000 psychiatrists, young psychiatrists by now, in which we are trying to give them these elementary communication skills, some of the skills of leadership, some of the other professional skills. And the reports are unanimous. Their life has become easier and they are more successful. And they find that this training was something that they really missed during their time in medical school and subsequently in postgraduate training. So here are some of the new areas in which we have to be, but we have to think in a more broader way of revision of education about mental health and illness in general. We've recently reviewed some textbooks of psychiatry, and large parts, 80% of them, have been copied from previous textbooks. And the same is true for many other books and many other teachers who just repeat what has happened, what they know very well, but what comes from an age that is not their own, from an age that is 40 years ago. And we should also think of changing the place of education. We should take a young person who is about to learn how to deal with anxiety disorders because of heart operations to the Department of Cardiology. And he should learn how to deal with the anxiety, preoperative anxiety, in the Department of Cardiology or Surgery or Cardiology. because it's that where the patient lives. It's that where he can learn the relevant skills which are being so important. Teaching people how to deal with mental illness in their home. And to do this, we have to very much think of who can be the best teachers for that. And there are very few medical schools which have regularly introduced parents and carers of people with mental illness as teachers. Because these people are spending 24 hours a day with a person, and they know exactly what are the issues that have to be addressed and the ways in which they have to be done. They're not invited, yet they are free to come, and they would be delighted. It would give them some feeling of value, which they are very often missing. And very often, because of the feeling of missing value, they also end up in a burnout. So we would help both them and the students who would learn from those with direct experience what they should be doing. And we should, in psychiatry in particular, be very careful and thinking who is suited for a psychiatrist and who is not. Because there are many professions within medicine in addition to psychiatry. So we should think of advising young candidates who enter into psychiatry, what would be the best way, and think about other professions, which means that we have to be sufficiently familiar with other professions and be in good contact with them so as to be able to give reasonable advice. And the notion of bringing medicine together, at least in terms of personal relationships, even if the clinics are now becoming different, is of tremendous importance and should be kept in mind. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think, expressing my optimism once more, I think that the future of psychiatry and of mental health sciences is bright. And if we invest ourselves sufficiently into it, I think that we can not only improve the fate of people with mental illness and their families, but also we can prevent many disorders that might be happening, improve the quality of life of ourselves and many other people if we did it well. And in a way, psychiatry has another task, and that is being the discipline that deals with the human mind and with the soul. It has to think of ways of returning humanity to medicine and making it a humane transaction rather than a dehumanized professional intervention. And I think we have a responsibility in this field as well. I thank you very much for your attention.